Something big just happened, and it changed the energy in Washington almost instantly. Marjorie Taylor Greene didn't inch toward controversy or build up to a political moment. She detonated one. Without warning, she carved out a new lane for herself, and the shockwaves hit every corner of the Capitol. And right as her announcement started dominating the feeds, Trump stepped into a completely different fight and flipped it on a group that thought they were holding the upper hand. The timing couldn't have been more pointed. Two storylines colliding, each reshaping the battlefield in its own way. So let's break down the moment MTG dropped her latest bomb. Her new statement wasn't chaotic or angry. It was deliberate, personal, and tightly aimed. She framed Washington as a place that punishes authenticity. A place where the more you try to represent regular Americans, the more isolated you become. She talked about dignity, loyalty, and the political machine that treats those qualities as vulnerabilities. And then she delivered the line that made her allies stop cold and her critics scramble to interpret. She wasn't stepping back from confrontation. She was escalating it. This time, she wasn't just challenging Democrats or feuding with the establishment. She was signaling she was done playing by rules she no longer respected. Her message was simple. If the system wanted a compliant version of her, it wasn't going to get one. And she paired that message with something else, something aimed squarely at Trump's orbit. She said power isn't earned by proximity. It's earned by conviction. She hinted that people who once stood shoulder to shoulder with Trump have quietly reshaped themselves into gatekeepers, deciding who counts as aligned and who doesn't. That line wasn't subtle, and it didn't take long for Trump's side to respond. Within hours, his team was pushing a counter-narrative, that MTG was creating drama to maintain relevance, that she was adopting stances that played better on social media than in Washington, and that her new posture wasn't strength but frustration. But that's not the full story. Behind the scenes, there's a deeper tension, one that's been building quietly for months. It involves foreign policy, internal alliances, and a growing divide over who actually has influence in the post-2024 conservative movement. MTG's critics inside the GOP claim she has drifted toward a faction that doesn't align with Trump's strategic goals. They say she's become unpredictable at a time when the party is trying to appear unified. Her supporters say the opposite. They argue she's the only one calling out the hypocrisy inside both parties. They see her as someone refusing to let Washington reshape her into something smaller than she promised her voters. And this is where the squad enters the picture in a surprising way. Because while MTG was launching her latest political strike, the squad was working on a completely separate push, one they believed would allow them to corner Trump publicly. They were preparing for a narrative battle, framing Trump as a destabilizing force abroad and a threat to civil liberties at home. But then Trump flipped the script. Instead of defending, he countered with a move the squad wasn't expecting, attacking them from a direction they hadn't prepared for. He zeroed in on their internal contradictions, highlighting the gap between their public messaging and their district-level outcomes. Jobs, crime, housing, local frustration. He packaged it all together and turned it into an indictment of their leadership. Suddenly, instead of MTG being isolated or Trump being on the defensive, the spotlight swung toward the squad's vulnerabilities. That's the part that really changed the conversation. Because MTG's message wasn't just about her own identity or her own battles. It was about a larger moment where Republicans who once felt tethered to Trump are testing boundaries, while Democrats who thought they had predictable targets suddenly find themselves exposed from a different angle. This is no longer the old battlefield where everyone knew their role. The lines are shifting. Alliances are shifting. Confidence is shifting. And MTG's latest move, combined with Trump's sudden pivot on the squad, signals a political phase where nothing is guaranteed and no relationship is permanent. The question now is what comes next. And that answer isn't going to be calm. Not with the factions that are forming. Not with the pressures building on both sides. And definitely not with MTG signaling she's just getting started. Something interesting happened right after MTG's statement began circulating. The reaction wasn't predictable. It wasn't the standard split of right versus left. It was more complicated and, honestly, more revealing. Inside the Republican Party, the first wave of responses didn't come from the establishment or the moderates. It came from the people who normally back her without hesitation, and their tone wasn't dismissive. It was cautious. They weren't sure what she was preparing for. Some believe she was laying the groundwork for a major independent push inside the conservative movement. Others thought she was signaling that she was ready to challenge the hierarchy that has formed around Trump. A few wondered if she knew something the rest of Washington didn't. And then there were those who said this was MTG doing what she does best, forcing conversations that people try to avoid until they can't anymore. But while Republicans were trying to decode her message, Democrats were celebrating. They thought this was a sign of fracture. They framed it as proof that Trump's influence was slipping and that the GOP's internal tensions were finally breaking into the open. Their confidence didn't last long, because just as they were preparing statements about Republican chaos, Trump made a sudden pivot that caught them off guard. He didn't respond to MTG directly. Instead, he went after the group that had been taunting him for weeks, the Squad. He attacked their record on local crime. He attacked their economic performance. He attacked their foreign policy contradictions, especially the ones that had become impossible for them to reconcile in their own districts. But here's what made this move different. Trump didn't aim at their national messaging. He aimed at their home turf. He spoke directly to the voters inside their districts. He highlighted the things those voters see every day: neighborhood decline, rising frustration, promises that didn't turn into outcomes. It was a targeted strike, and it worked. Almost immediately, the Squad shifted from offense to defense. They held press conferences. They pushed back on social media. They tried to reframe the narrative into one about Trump being divisive and dangerous. But the problem wasn't Trump's tone. The problem was that he had exposed the very issues their own voters had been raising for months. And in politics, once a weakness is named out loud, it's almost impossible to unhear it. This is where MTG unintentionally made the impact even stronger. Because while Trump was hammering the Squad on governance, MTG's message from earlier in the day was still circulating. Washington punishes authenticity. Washington suppresses conviction. Washington bends people into shapes that don't match what voters need. That message didn't just apply to her own party. It applied directly to the Squad, who have been facing their own internal rebellions from progressives who believe they've gone quiet on big issues in exchange for influence. For the first time in a long time, there were fractures beginning to appear on both sides of the political map. Republicans dealing with ideological differences that no longer fit neatly under the Trump umbrella. Democrats facing discontent among the very young voters and activists who once formed the Squad's core. And in the middle of all of this, MTG's sudden move reshaped the conversation by suggesting that influence in Washington is no longer controlled by traditional power centers. This is what made the day so unusual. Two different storms happening at the same time, each affecting the other, even though neither side intended it. As Democrats scrambled to defend the Squad, Republicans began asking a different question. Was MTG signaling a new phase of political independence, or was she drawing a line in the sand to force Trump into a choice? Because make no mistake, the tension between Trump and MTG isn't about personality. It's about direction. She believes certain issues demand transparency. She believes certain alliances need rethinking. She believes the future of the Republican Party can't run on autopilot, especially when voters are demanding more than recycled slogans. Trump, meanwhile, wants strict discipline inside the movement. He wants loyalty to be clear. He wants internal debates to happen behind closed doors, not in front of millions of people online. Those two approaches cannot coexist peacefully, and that's why their clash has grown more visible. But here's the part that most analysts overlooked. MTG didn't attack Trump. She didn't insult him. She didn't accuse him of anything. She didn't even hint at disloyalty. She challenged the environment around him. She questioned the people who have become gatekeepers in his orbit. She questioned the priorities being set in his name. She questioned the pressure campaigns being run behind the scenes. That is far more dangerous than a direct attack, because a direct confrontation is easy to dismiss. A systemic critique is much harder. Trump understood that immediately, which is why he wasted no time redirecting the national conversation toward the squad's vulnerabilities. It was a classic political maneuver. Shift the battlefield before your opponent defines it. But MTG's message didn't disappear. It kept spreading. Not because it was explosive, but because it touched on something a lot of people on the right and left quietly feel, that both parties are running on old assumptions in a world that has completely changed. And if that feeling continues to grow, the next political realignment won't come from think tanks or strategists. It will come from people who are willing to risk their careers to force the issue. Whether MTG becomes one of those people is still unclear. But what is clear is that the day she dropped her latest bomb, she made it impossible to pretend that the political map is stable. Trump sent a warning shot. The squad was knocked off balance. And Washington realized something it hates to admit. Control is starting to slip out of the hands of people who thought they had everything locked down. The real shift came later in the day when Washington started realizing something unusual. MTG's message wasn't fading. Normally, a political statement, no matter how loud, gets buried under the next storyline within hours. But this one didn't. It kept circulating. It kept getting clipped, shared, debated, questioned. And the more people replayed it, the more analysts realized it wasn't just a personal declaration. It was a strategic repositioning. She wasn't distancing herself from Trump to weaken him. She was distancing herself from the people around him who, in her view, have weaponized access and influence. And that distinction matters, because for years, the conservative movement has operated under the assumption that everyone inside the Trump orbit moves as one unified bloc. But MTG's message exposed a reality insiders have quietly acknowledged. There are factions within that orbit, and those factions don't always share the same goals. By pointing to the machine, she wasn't attacking Trump. She was warning that there are people who manage his environment, shape his perception, and gatekeep who gets elevated or sidelined. That accusation hit nerves everywhere. The first to react were the operatives who understood exactly what she was referring to. They pushed back hard, framing her as reckless and claiming she was undermining unity. But unity isn't what this moment is about. It's about leverage. And MTG, whether intentionally or simply through instinct, positioned herself at a pressure point that Washington spends a lot of energy pretending doesn't exist. While all this was unfolding, the squad entered the conversation again, not because they wanted to, but because Trump kept pressing them. Every hour or so, a new clip, statement, or commentary from his circle targeted a specific weakness in their record. He wasn't trying to win an argument with them. He was trying to redefine them in the eyes of their own constituents. And that's when Democrats realized something. MTG's repositioning, combined with Trump's offensive, had cut into the story they wanted to tell about Republican turmoil. Instead of Republicans looking fractured, Democrats suddenly looked vulnerable. The squad, who built their brand on insurgent authenticity, were now being portrayed as the exact thing MTG accused Washington of being, a machine that talks like rebels but governs like insiders. This created a strange mirror effect. On one side, MTG was telling her base that Washington molds people to protect power rather than challenge it. On the other side, Trump was telling the squad's voters that their leaders had become too entrenched to deliver anything meaningful. Two messages. Two different audiences. Same theme. Political elites are failing the people who put them there. That shared theme resonated far more deeply than either side expected. For Republican voters who admire MTG, her message validated a growing suspicion that not everyone around Trump shares his agenda. For progressive voters in squad districts, Trump's attacks, despite coming from an adversary, echoed complaints they've been making privately, that the squad's national fame hasn't translated into local improvements. That convergence created a moment Washington hates: overlap. Overlap is dangerous because it signals that voters across the spectrum are frustrated with institutions, not just personalities. And when voter frustration aligns, no matter how briefly, it often triggers a political recalibration. Inside the GOP, that recalibration is already happening. MTG's willingness to challenge internal dynamics emboldened other Republicans who feel marginalized or ignored by the dominant factions. They may not agree with her on policy, but they agree with her on one thing: Washington tries to control people rather than represent them. Inside the Democratic Party, that recalibration is overdue. The squad was once untouchable, shielded by their popularity with young voters. But their districts are changing. Their coalitions are shifting. And Trump's targeted criticisms forced national Democrats to confront vulnerabilities they'd rather avoid. Meanwhile, MTG's growing independence created an unexpected political vacuum. Some Republicans see an opportunity for a new ideological lane, one that blends populism with skepticism of foreign entanglements, distrust of the political class, and demands for transparency. Others fear it could fracture the coalition at a moment when Trump wants absolute message discipline heading into the next election cycle. And that's where the tension becomes unavoidable, because MTG's move wasn't impulsive. It was timed. It was coordinated. It was deliberate. She released her statement on a day when Democrats thought they had the narrative advantage. She delivered it at a moment when Republicans were navigating internal disagreements over foreign policy and spending. She sent a signal that the party cannot ignore, no matter how loudly strategists dismiss it. And then, hours later, Trump redirected the national spotlight toward the squad so forcefully that it overshadowed every attempt by Democrats to turn MTG's message into proof of Republican instability. That combination, an internal challenge on the right and an offensive strike on the left, reshaped the day. But the most important thing is this: both moves showed that neither Trump nor MTG intends to operate on autopilot. They are both recalibrating, and they are doing so publicly. That is rare. Usually, political recalibrations happen behind closed doors, through private meetings, donor pressure, and quiet negotiations. This time, it's happening out in the open, in real time, in front of millions of people. And when recalibration becomes public, it sets off-chain reactions. Strategists begin adjusting their messaging. Journalists begin reinterpreting prior statements. Opponents begin reassessing which alliances are fragile. Voters begin questioning whether the people they elected are still aligned with their expectations. This is why MTG's latest move matters far more than critics want to admit. It's not about her resigning, repositioning, or reframing. It's about the signal she sent to everyone watching. Nothing is locked in. Nothing is guaranteed. Nothing is inevitable. And Trump's response to the squad reinforced the same message. Power isn't static. You can change the entire direction of a conversation with one decisive strike. Washington hates unpredictability, but unpredictability is exactly what this moment is becoming. And the people who understand that are the ones who are starting to shape the next phase of the political landscape. What made the situation even more volatile was what happened once the evening news cycle kicked in. Producers, anchors, and political commentators tried to frame the day's events as two unrelated stories, but it didn't work. The more they analyzed each piece, the more they unintentionally connected the dots. MTG's message about Washington shaping people, muting their convictions, and turning independence into a liability suddenly seemed relevant to more than just her corner of the Republican Party. It applied to the squad. It applied to the establishment on both sides. It applied to anyone who built a political identity on being an outsider but found themselves pressured into conformity once they reached the Capitol. And that's when the conversation started shifting into a more uncomfortable zone, one where insiders could no longer pretend that their influence was stable. Democrats were nervous because Trump had exposed the squad's vulnerability among their own voters. Republicans were nervous because MTG had exposed the uncomfortable truth that not everyone around Trump shares the same motives. By nightfall, it was no longer about which politician said what. It was about a deeper realization. Both parties were facing internal cracks that could no longer be dismissed as minor disagreements. Inside the Democratic Party, staffers began expressing frustration that the squad had already started to drift away from the bold stances that made them famous. They feared those inconsistencies would become ammunition for Republicans in districts that were already showing signs of fatigue. Inside the Republican Party, some operatives began privately questioning whether Trump's movement had become too dependent on gatekeepers who control messaging, access, and loyalty tests. And all of this surfaced because MTG's message forced everyone to confront something Washington hates admitting. The power centers that claim to represent the people often end up representing themselves. As this played out on social media, a strange alignment formed among voters who usually have nothing in common. Progressives who once idolized the squad started echoing the same frustration that MAGA voters had about Washington insiders. Conservative populists saw MTG's move as confirmation that authenticity is becoming rare. Independents saw both stories as proof that neither side has clean hands. It was no longer a left-right narrative. It was a system versus voters narrative. That narrative is the one Washington fears most. Because once people start seeing the system itself as the problem, the parties lose their grip on how stories get shaped. They lose the ability to control who gets blamed. They lose the comfort of predictable political dynamics. This is why the timing of MTG's move mattered so much. She struck at the precise moment when frustration with Washington was already peaking. Over foreign policy, over spending, over transparency, over leadership that seems more focused on internal stability than public interest. Then Trump added pressure by hitting the squad where they were weakest. It wasn't about policy disagreements. It was about credibility. And when credibility becomes the battleground, both sides suddenly look exposed. By late evening, strategists across Washington were having uncomfortable conversations. They weren't talking about how to spin the day's events. They were talking about what the day revealed. Republicans began asking whether the movement needs a reset, one where loyalty to Trump coexists with the freedom for independent voices like MTG to challenge the machinery around him. Democrats began asking whether the squad can survive growing frustration in districts where promises of change have collided with the realities of governance. And quietly, behind closed doors, both sides started acknowledging something they rarely say out loud. Washington is entering a phase where authenticity is becoming more valuable than rank, seniority, or committee power. Politicians who speak plainly, even when it causes chaos, are rising. Politicians who rely on scripted messaging are losing influence. And political machines built to manage perception are becoming weaker in an era where voters have stopped accepting polished narratives. That's the underlying shift that MTG's latest move tapped into. She may not have planned it as a larger commentary on the entire system, but that's exactly how it landed. Trump's attack on the squad only amplified that shift. He didn't argue about ideology. He argued about results. He pointed to what voters see every day, not what politicians brag about on social media. This combination created a moment Washington couldn't control, a narrative they couldn't redirect, and a conversation they couldn't bury. By night's end, the landscape looked different. Neither side could claim dominance. Neither side could claim unity. Neither side could pretend the day's events were isolated. The system felt exposed. And the people who recognized that, MTG on one side, Trump confronting the squad on the other, were the ones who ended the day with more influence than they started with. By the next morning, the shock had settled into something far more significant. a recognition that the political terrain had shifted in ways no one could fully control. What began as two separate storylines, MTG challenging the internal dynamics of her own party and Trump flipping the pressure back onto the squad, had merged into a single, larger narrative about power, influence, and the growing revolt against political machinery. Washington tried to regain control of the conversation. It always does. But the public wasn't buying the usual talking points. People weren't arguing about party lines. They were debating who was actually telling the truth and who was just protecting their position. That's the kind of environment where unexpected leaders emerge. And it's also the kind of environment where entrenched figures start to feel the ground slipping beneath them. MTG's message had given voice to something many voters on the right had been feeling but hadn't said out loud. That the movement built around Trump is strongest when it reflects the will of the people, not the agenda of individuals who position themselves as gatekeepers. Trump's takedown of the squad had exposed another uncomfortable reality. The political left's most celebrated disruptors were now wrestling with the same criticisms they once aimed at the establishment. Voters in their own districts were asking questions they didn't want to answer. For both sides, the illusion of security was gone. What remained was raw accountability. And that's exactly why the day hit so hard. It wasn't just political drama. It was a reckoning. Republicans realized someone inside their ranks was challenging not their ideology, but their structure. Someone was calling out the layers of influence that operate behind the scenes, shaping decisions ordinary voters never see. Democrats realized their biggest stars, people who built national brands by promising to upend the system, were now being portrayed as protectors of that same system. For Washington, this is the worst possible scenario, when the public stops accepting surface-level narratives and starts connecting the deeper patterns. And here's where everything comes full circle. MTG's move didn't weaken the conservative movement. It exposed its next phase. A phase where voters expect not just loyalty, but honesty. Not just alignment, but courage. Not just messaging, but conviction. Trump's offensive against the squad didn't just humiliate them. It showed that he's still capable of redefining political battles by going directly to the voters who feel forgotten in the noise. And as these two forces played out side by side, Washington realized something that left both parties uneasy. The political future is going to be shaped less by institutional power and more by those willing to challenge it. That's why this moment matters. Because it revealed that the energy driving American politics isn't coming from the committees, the strategists, or the polished talkers. It's coming from the individuals who refuse to be managed, whether you agree with them or not. MTG's signal was unmistakable. She's not bending. She's not retreating. She's not accepting the quiet pressure to play within the lines. Trump's signal was just as clear. He's choosing his battlegrounds carefully, and he's still capable of forcing his opponents into defensive positions they didn't plan for. And together, whether intentionally coordinated or not, their moves showed that the real fight in Washington isn't between Republicans and Democrats. It's between those who want to keep the system predictable and those who are willing to blow that predictability apart. That's what made this moment so explosive. And that's why the aftershocks aren't stopping anytime soon. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.